jump right in to the 10 things that you did not know about me. Now, someone's saying you're not a natural redhead. Part of me wishes that was the case, but I'm definitely a natural redhead. So there you go. All right. 10 things you did not know about Caleb Maupin. Number 1, I once won $100 for impersonating Elvis Presley. That's right. When I was a student, I won $100 for my Elvis impersonation. I dressed in the costume, I got a wig, and I impersonated Elvis, and I won. I won the school talent show, and it was a hit. It was on local access television, that was eighth grade, and I brought the house down. Audience participation. I did Elvis, and I won $100, and that was a big deal. People talked to me about it around town for the next 5 years of my life. I would go everywhere. You're that Elvis guy? You won the contest dressing as Elvis? I'd be like, yes, I was the Elvis guy. I was the Elvis guy. I won $100, and it was interesting because my grandmother, her minister at her church, she was a Lutheran. Her minister was also an Elvis impersonator. So he actually trained me to be an Elvis impersonator. So I remember I went and sat down with the minister and my grandmother's minister, and he showed me little moves to make and how to shake my knees and the kind of things to do with my voice and the lip. And I learned to be an Elvis impersonator from my grandmother's minister, and that's how I ended up winning $100 as an Elvis impersonator. So there you go. I bet you never guessed that I won $100 for my Elvis impersonation. But that's why I promised you that this is a live about things you did not know about me, and you didn't know that. Next one. I spent 2 weeks at Butte Reservation. I bet you didn't know that, right? But yes, when I was a high school student, I went and volunteered at Butte Reservation. That is a Native American reservation. And I stayed there for 2 weeks. I helped clean out a graveyard. I worked in the community center. It was quite an experience for me to spend a lot of time on this reservation. It was quite an experience. I had never done that before. And it was educational for me. And I would see the AIM newspaper for the American Indian Movement, like in gas stations. And there was kind of a pride in the indigenous heritage. The reservations were very divided. You had Native Americans who'd converted to Christianity and Native Americans who practiced indigenous religions. There was a big divide. A lot of Native Americans are in the U.S. military. I didn't know that. But yeah, that was an experience for me, and I'm really glad I had that experience. So that was number 2. Number 3, I had an uncle who was in Hollywood movies. Bet you didn't know that, but yes. My Uncle James, my mother's brother, he was a theater professor in Chicago, and he had been in a number of movies. He was in the movie A Bridge Too Far as an extra, and he was in a number of Hollywood movies. He was in an episode of Chicago Story, which was like a police show, and he had a lot of acting gigs in TV and movies, and he was kind of my hero when I was a kid. Right? Because I lived in a very, very small rural area, but he lived in Chicago, which was this big city. And I would go to his apartment with him and my aunt, and, I would see they were in theater, they were in movies, and they were living in Evanston, which was in Chicago. And wow, I was just in awe of my uncle. And he was in movies, and he taught acting classes. He was an acting professor. And he actually died when I was 11 years old. He had a heart condition called Marfan's syndrome, and he died. And his memorial was very widely attended, and he was a bagpiper. He played the bagpipes, and he because of his heart condition, he couldn't ride a normal bicycle, so he rode a recumbent bicycle, and he actually biked around the world in his recumbent bicycle. So he was like well known as this promoter of recumbent bicycles. Those are bicycles where instead of having the bars in front of you, you have the bars behind you. So he was really a go-getter. He was somebody who did a lot of things, and he eventually, he died at the age of 45 from his heart condition. But he was kind of my hero when I was a kid, and he was in movies, and he was a professor, and yeah, that was my uncle. I really looked up to my uncle. He wore a leather jacket all the time. He thought that was very cool. He wore a leather jacket, but he didn't want people to think he was a racist because apparently a lot of biker guys are. So he wore a leather jacket, and he had this button with racism crossed out on his leather jacket, so no one would think he was a racist. So he wore a leather jacket with this, no racism button on it. That was my uncle, my Uncle James, who died when I was 11, and he was kind of my hero. So there you go. All right. Another thing I bet you didn't know about Caleb. That Which one do I want to do next? I'm not doing these in any particular order. Oh, well, I was given a shotgun when I turned 18. My grandfather loved shotguns. And when we would go visit my grandfather in Missouri, we would go shoot clay pigeons, right? They had this machine, these discs, ceramic discs, and you would take the shotgun and you would shoot the shotgun. And it was a tradition in my father's family that any time that that a young man turned 18, my grandfather would give them a shotgun. And so I remember I was 18 and my grandfather gave me a shotgun. And I had no desire to own a shotgun. So as soon as we were gone, I said to my dad turned to me, he said, "Do you want the shotgun?" I said, "No." And he said, "Okay, I'll get rid of it." And I never actually owned it. Like I guess, it was given to me and then my dad got rid of it. But yeah, I had no desire to own a shotgun. But yes, when I was 18, my grandfather made a big deal of giving me a shotgun, as he gave to every young man. Okay, here's one thing I bet you didn't know about me. I have a theory about the Washington Monument. I have a theory about the Washington Monument. Right? Now, we all know it's cliche. What does the Washington Monument look like? Right? We all know what it looks like. But there's more to that story. Folks who look into the life of George Washington, the father of our country, will know that George Washington's children were all adopted. Why? Because when George Washington was a child, he had the measles. And it left him sterile. And George Washington was unable to have an erection. Right? George Washington was unable to have an erection. So the statue, the Washington Monument, looks a lot like something that George Washington could not do. My theory has always been that George Washington was old, and he was sitting around in the bar with his friends, and they said, "George, you have it all. You're the richest man in the 13 colonies. You're the richest, you're the first president of the United States. You're this very prominent military leader. But there's one thing that all of us can do that you cannot do. And so when you die, as a joke, we are going to make a statue of the one thing that you cannot do." That's why the Washington Monument was built. Now, I have no evidence of this, but I find it to be an odd coincidence that George Washington, who could not have an erection, his monument looks like a giant erection. It's odd. Things like that just don't happen, right? And no one ever talks about the fact that he was sterile, that he had measles as a child and could not have an erection. So I think, it's supposed to be an Egyptian obelisk, but I have a feeling that it's an inside joke. That's my theory, right? Put that in your pipe and smoke it. I could be completely wrong. Definitely not a historian. But I have a feeling that that's what was going on there. Alrighty, what other things do you not know about Caleb? Oh, here's one. I taught a class of white kids, all white kids, about Kwanzaa. When I was a senior in high school, I was a student teacher. I was part of this program they had at my high school called Career Pathways to the Teaching Profession, where you got college credit for taking a class on education, and then you were a student teacher. You would assist teachers. And so I was part of that program, and I taught fourth grade. I taught in a first grade class, then I taught in a fourth grade class. And in the fourth grade class, I was with them, and there were 3 days before the holiday, and the teacher had me come up with a lesson plan. And I said, well, why don't I do a lesson on holidays other than Christmas, other than the Christian holiday of Christmas? And she said, well, that's a great idea. And so I taught them about Hanukkah, and then I taught them about Kwanzaa. And I'll tell you, this class full of all white kids, every kid in that class was white. They thought Kwanzaa was the coolest thing they had ever heard of. I showed them videos about Kwanzaa. We talked about it. I went over, there's like 14 principles of Kwanzaa, and they thought Kwanzaa was really, really cool. They wanted to have a Kwanzaa party. The teacher said, no, let's not get out of control. But I remember I had a great time teaching a class of fourth graders who were all white about Kwanzaa. That was cool. That was one of my coolest experiences. And in a way, I feel like it was a little bit of activism because, that was the year I graduated from high school. It was 2005, 2006, right? That school year. And that was the time when Bill O'Reilly was having this War on Christmas campaign. And if you said Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas, that was like this big crime. So to teach these kids about, these kids were all white and they were all Christian, but to let them know that there are other holidays out there. In a way, it was kind of an activist-y thing to do. It was kind of fun, too. I mean, the kids thought Kwanzaa was very, very, very cool. So there you go. You can look into the history, right? Kwanzaa was started by Dr. Ron Karenga, who was a black nationalist. He was against the Black Panthers, right? And the FBI kind of used him to attack some Black Panthers. So Kwanzaa itself has a shady past, but a lot of revolutionaries who admire black nationalism don't admire Kwanzaa because it's associated with this guy who killed Black Panthers. I think Ann Coulter wrote an article called Kwanzaa, the Holiday Brought to You by the FBI. There's a whole shady history there. But regardless, teaching a class full of fourth graders in my little tiny town about Kwanzaa was a great experience, and I'm really glad that I did it. So there you go. I taught a class of kids who were all white about Kwanzaa. All right. How about this one? I don't hold pens correctly. Folks, I don't hold pens correctly. Anyone who's met me in real life, people always notice it. They say, why don't you hold your pen correctly? I have long, bony fingers, and I just, you're supposed to hold it like this, but I just don't do it. I hold my pens like this. I write like this. I always have. And people notice it and they just are perplexed. And when I was in school, they tried so hard to make me write normally with a pen. They were so determined to make me write normally with a pen. I had teacher would always she would see me and she would force my hand into the right position 2-3 times a day. Hold your pencil right. First grade, second grade, third grade, fifth grade, they just kind of gave up on me, right? I hold my pens like this. I don't hold them like you're supposed to like this. This position doesn't fit with my fingers, right? I hold my pens like this. I always have. I write strangely, right? So there you go. So I don't hold my pens correctly, and great attempts were made throughout my educational experience to force me to hold my pen correctly. I just am not capable of doing it with my long, bony fingers. So there you go. All righty. I don't hold pens correctly. What else? Oh, I aspired to be a screenwriter and playwright. That's what I wanted to do. When I was a kid, I had it in my head that I was going to be a screenwriter. I was going to make movies. I bought books. My parents, even for my birthday, would give me books on how to be a screenwriter, the principles of style. I learned how to write a screenplay, that the special format where the person who says the line, their name is center, right? And then you have the text in the middle. And you have, very, very intense, complicated, like scene descriptions. And it's, I wanted to be a screenwriter. And, I really loved Ian Fleming. I read all the James Bond books, and I thought Ian Fleming had this really, really, romantic lifestyle. I mean, he lived on like an island off the coast of Jamaica, and and I don't know. I thought Ian Fleming was this amazing writer, and he was rich, and I liked Arthur Miller, and I read about Arthur Miller, and thought he had this amazing lifestyle, and I was going to be a screenwriter. That's what I was going to do, and I really liked horror movies. I really liked, the Hammer films, right? Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And I had it in my mind I was going to be a horror movie writer. I was going to write vampire movies. I was going to write action movies like Ian Fleming, and I was going to be this writer. And that's what I aspired to be. I aspired to be this screenwriter and playwright. And I wrote a couple plays. I wrote, in my church. I remember the minister gave a sermon about Ulrich Zwingli, who was a leader of the Reformation in Switzerland, who the church I grew up in, traced its heritage back to Ulrich Zwingli and the Swiss Reform movement or whatever. So I remember I wrote this play, and it was performed by my church. And it was this whole thing. I wrote this whole play about the life of Ulrich Zwingli. Yeah, I mean, I was, yeah, I mean, I wanted to be a playwright. I wanted to be a screenwriter. And then I got political. All right, 9/11, I couldn't escape politics, got into politics, and at that point, I got political and, had no desire to be a screenwriter or a playwright. I wanted to be political. I wanted to, fight against U.S. imperialism. And yeah, when I got political, my desire to be a screenwriter faded away. But that was what I had set out to do when I was young. All right. All right. Number 9. My grandmother was a feminist. Very interesting. So my grandmother, right, my mother's mother, was quite a woman. She was from Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. And I guess, so her father had been a coal miner, and her mother, had been married to him, obviously. But then, she was like one of a number of children, I think 5 or 6, 7 or 8, 9 children. And when the Great Depression hit, when everyone was desperate for food, they arranged for her to live with her aunt and uncle in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. So that's where she grew up. So she was raised actually by her aunt and uncle because of the Great Depression. And in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, she was the valedictorian of her class. And she graduated from high school in like the mid-1930s. And she was the valedictorian. And for a woman to be the valedictorian of their class in the 1930s was not very common. And she got a full ride, and she went to college at Otterbein University, I believe. Or I believe was it Otterbein? Or I forget which college she went to. I don't think it was that. I think it was another one. But she got a full ride because she'd been the valedictorian of her high school. And she was a nurse. She was in the Army Corps of Nurses during the Second World War. And she treated people who'd been injured during D-Day. And she said that was quite an experience. When all those guys were storming the beaches and getting shot and whatever, and she was in London, they would fly him back to a hospital, and she took care of people who had their arms and legs blown off and stuff from Normandy, from the invasion of Normandy. But then the story that always stood out about her, that really made her a feminist, I guess, was that when my mother was in high school, they had a policy at the high school that my mother went to that if a girl was pregnant, she was expelled from school, right? And that was the way that they did things. That's the old style. Now they have, they have like a special way, like they have tutors who go to their house, or if a teenage girl gets pregnant, she can still go to high school. But they had this policy, getting pregnant, automatically expelled from school. Right? So my grandmother heard about this policy, right, and was outraged about it. She said, that is not right. And she went to the school board, and she got up and she gave this thunderous, angry speech to the school board, just yelled at them. How dare you? How dare you? We want the children in our community to have parents who are educated. How dare you kick teenage girls out of school? deny them the ability to get a high school diploma for getting pregnant. How dare you? And she just screamed, like everyone was like, and this was like the 19 early 1970s, right? In a small town, it was just not the kind of thing that you did, right? But my grandmother she couldn't stand it. And she had a reputation for this, and people would talk about it years later. They'd be like, my grandma, your grandmother, she's the one who went and screamed at the school board I mean, so that was my grandmother. That was my grandmother, right? So there you go. My grandmother was a feminist. She definitely was a feminist. She died in, I think, 2012. She died, and I went to her memorial service. People told the stories about her. I was close to her in high school and all of that. I mean, I grew up around my grandmother, but I went back to Ohio for her memorial, and people remembered her as a feminist. She was definitely a feminist. She was a high achieving woman. That was she. She died in her 90s. I think she was like 92 when she died, and very high achieving woman. She'd been through the Second World War, and yeah, my grandmother was definitely a feminist. Bet you didn't know that about me. All right, and the last of the 10 things you didn't know about Caleb was that at one point I was obsessed with the musical Hair. I don't know if people know about the musical Hair, but the musical Hair was the ultimate hippie musical, right? The Age of Aquarius, Let the Sun Shine In. I was obsessed with Hair at one point in my life. I had not just I had the CD of Hair, I had the original vinyl record album. I had the script of Hair. I knew about songs that had been originally cut from the show. I knew Hair like the back of my hand. It was weird. It's a Broadway musical from the 1970s, stupid counterculture, but it was, and when I was like a teenager, I thought the musical Hair was the coolest thing ever. And I don't know why. Definitely not my views now. Now I'm ranting against synthetic left and counterculture and all that. But I thought the musical Hair, the song "Walking in Space" about their LSD trip. Um, what else? I mean, it's about a draftee. I mean, it's a musical. The main character is like going to be drafted into the U.S. military, and he doesn't want to go, and so he spends the musical kind of walking around and talking to different hippies about whether he should join the military and taking drugs and having sex, and it's rock and roll, and it was a big hit in the late 60s. It was on Broadway. It was a hit. It was just like a hit. And I mean, obviously that I wasn't, I liked theater. I had an uncle who was a theater professor and all that, but I hadn't ever heard of a play like that. So I got really into the musical Hair. And in fact, the musical Hair was very, very controversial, because when it was performed on Broadway, the climax of the first act, of Hair, involved the cast walking onto the stage completely naked, um, right? As the character burns his draft card, and then the audience, or not the audience, but the chorus is singing the words "beads, flowers, freedom, happiness," and then the entire cast of the musical walks onto the stage naked, right? And that was, of course, very controversial, and having a public Broadway play. And then someone dressed as a police officer walks onto the stage and arrests the audience for 15 minutes to have the intermission. It was quite a Broadway play. It was like a hippie play. It was a counterculture play. And, I don't think much of it now, but at the time I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So there you go. You now know 10 things about Caleb that you did not know before. I guess they're kind of political in a way. They're kind of political, right? My grandma. You now know that I won $100 for impersonating Elvis, that I spent 2 weeks on Eagle Butte Reservation, that I had an uncle who was in Hollywood movies, that I aspired to be a screenwriter and playwright, that my grandfather gave me a shotgun, that I don't hold pens correctly, that I have a theory about the Washington Monument, that I taught a class of white kids about Kwanzaa, that my grandmother was a feminist, and that I was at one point obsessed with the musical Hair. Those are 10 things you did not know about me that you now know. So feel very, very lucky to know about those things. I'm just killing time here, Corona streaming. But people think it's better when I talk about things like this. When I tell little anecdotes and stories, it's better, right? So there you go. I'm telling you anecdotes and stories, trying to pass the time, trying to enjoy myself. But if there's anything else people want me to talk about, I'll happily talk about it. I have some books here I can talk to you about. I have some books here. JT24 says Caleb is very fascinating. Well, thank you, JT24. I think I'm fascinating as well. Don't we all think we're all fascinating? But seriously, I enjoy getting to know you all. I want to know you all. That's one of the best things about this Discord is I just wanted to know who the people were. I have no idea who you are. I have you call out your names and locations, but I have no idea who you are. But you all are with me. There's hundreds of you. There's thousands of people who watch these live. I mean, look at the unique view count and all of that. I mean, there's thousands of people that love to just listen to Caleb ramble about politics every week.